Hello everyone, I'm Anita with AnitaByDesign.com and welcome back to the Beginner's Sewing Course. Today we're starting project number 4 and we're making a shirt. But before I get into telling you the tools that you're going to need for this project, I want to cover a few topics based on questions that you guys have asked. There was a question as to how you know if you're working on the wrong side or the right side of the fabric if it's not obvious. So I will be covering that for you today. There was also a question about fabric, the grain of the fabric, and how do you know if you're laying your pattern pieces out on the true grain. So I will be covering grain and showing you guys how to find the grain of your fabric. There was also a question as to how do you know how many pieces of or how many cuts of a certain pattern piece to cut. So I will revisit that and show you guys on the pattern piece where it tells you how many pieces to cut and whether you're cutting it on the fold or away from the fold. And then there was a question as to seam finishes. Someone wanted to know how to do different seam finishes. So I will be showing you guys 3 different seam finishes, the 3 that I think are the easiest. And finally, I will show you guys a hem, how to hem a skirt, the top that we're making today, and I will show you a few different techniques for hemming. So let's get started. Let's talk about the tools that we're going to need to create your shirt. And first of all, your pattern. And you'll be happy to know that we're using the same pattern that we used to create our maxi skirt. So you're going to need New Look 6458. Now, for those of you who are plus size, you can use Butterick 5215 because this pattern goes up to a size 22 only. And I realize that some of you need a larger size pattern. So you can use 5215 and you should be able to follow along as I sew this skirt and be able to do the same thing. And I will be careful and make sure I'm more mindful of that in the future, of choosing a pattern that has larger sizes. So you need your pattern, and again, this pattern calls for a stretch fabric. So you're going to need a knit fabric, stretchy fabric, and make sure you pre-treat your fabric before you start your project so that you don't get shrinkage after you create your garment. You're going to need your fabric scissors, your paper scissors, and your tiny scissors or your nippers to use at your sewing machine, your ballpoint straight pins, your metal washers that you can use as pattern weights, your seam gauge. Also, you're going to need your marking pens. You can use the disappearing ink pen, your water-soluble pencil, or a water-soluble pen. Now let me say something about the disappearing ink pen that I didn't mention before, and it's very important. If you're not going to be finishing your project the same day or the next day, then don't use this because you may come back and your marks will be gone. So make sure you use a water-soluble pen or pencil in a contrasting color if you're not going to sew your project up the same day. Your tracing wheel and tracing paper. Of course, your measuring tape so that we can take measurements. And if you have this book, we're going to use it, and if you don't have it, I highly recommend getting this book. It is so helpful, and today we're going to do a pattern adjustment for a full bust, and the instructions are in here, and I'm going to show you guys how to do that because it is a very common adjustment when you're sewing tops. So if you don't have it, I highly recommend getting it. I purchased mine from Amazon.com. It's not very expensive, and it's a very helpful tool to have in your stash. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with adjusting your pattern piece for a full bust measurement. And I'm going to follow the instruction from this book. And I didn't make copies to give you guys because of copyright laws. But according to what Nancy teaches us, and the book is called Pattern Fitting with Confidence by Nancy Zeman. And she teaches us how to choose a pattern based on our right size measurement. And the right size measurement is a measurement that you take across your chest in between your 2 armpits. Okay? And that helps you to choose the proper size pattern for your upper body because the pattern companies tell us to choose our pattern based on a bust measurement. But what happens is if you have a full bust, is you choose your pattern according to that measurement, but when you finish your garment, you have this gaping neckline, and Nancy calls it gaposis. So it's not very attractive, and it's a very common problem when you have a full bust. Even sometimes when you don't. I've had the problem too, and I'm not blessed in that area like some of you, but I have had the gaping neck. So once I learned how to choose the right size pattern, I don't have that anymore. And so what you will find is when you take your right size measurement and choose your pattern based on that measurement, that you're going to be choosing a smaller size pattern for your top. But it's okay, because you can make the adjustment for the bust area and the waist, or wherever you need to make an adjustment for your pattern to be smaller. And that area, but we want to make sure we get that pattern to fit around your neckline and the shoulders, because that's a hard adjustment to make. Okay, so we're going to learn how to do that, and I'll show you when we get to that part. So let's go ahead, pull out your pattern pieces, and don't cut yet. Just we're going to take your measurement first before we adjust the pattern piece. So let's take your measurements. Okay, we're taking 2 separate measurements to decide which size pattern or which line you're going to cut on to make this shirt. So take your tape measure, and the first measurement we're going to take is called, according to Nancy Zeman's teaching in this book, is the right size measurement. And that measurement we're going to take, if you hold your arms down like this, and I suggest getting a friend to help you take this measurement if you can. If not, you can take it on your own, but it's easier if you have someone to help take the measurement for you. So you're going to put your arms down, and you're going to measure from this crease right above your armpit to this crease, straight across your chest. And that's called your right size measurement. So take your tape measure, and with the 1, of course, go just above that crease. From here, straight across to just above the crease on the other side. And let me turn to the mirror to make sure I have mine set properly. Nope, I was up too high. And make sure you're wearing undergarments when you take this measure. You don't want to wear any bulky clothing or any material up in this area, because you won't get a proper measurement. So from this crease just above the crease in your arm here to just above the crease in your arm here, that will give you your right size measurement. Okay, so I have my measurement. And with that measurement, you're going to look at, if you have the book, on page 9, there's a chart that tells you which size pattern you will cut based on your right size measurement. Now, I will go through this chart for those of you who don't have the book. But again, I highly recommend getting this book, not only for this, but there are a number of pattern alterations that she teaches in this book that some of us will need. Now, I just want you to know, I have no affiliation with Nancy or her company, so I'm not getting paid to share this. This is the book that I use, and I just want to share the information because it's been helpful for me. So, if you are a measurement, and this is for Mrs. size patterns, if you measure 12 inches across the top of the chest, your pattern size will be a 6. Oh, when you take your measurements, round up to the next half size. So if you're a 12, your pattern size will be 6. If you're a 12 and a half, your pattern size will be 8. And the sizes go up by the ½ inch. So with each ½ inch increase, you're going to go up to the next pattern size. So 13 is a size 10. 13 and a half measurement is a size 12, and it keeps going up by the ½ inch with each increasing size in the pattern. Now, for a plus size, your measurement starts at a 15 according to her chart. So if you measure a 15 across the chest, then your pattern size will be 38. And then if you're a 15 and a half, the next size is a pattern size is a 40, and by each ½ inch you go up a pattern size. So that's how you find the right size pattern for you to cut. Now, keep in mind that pattern size is probably going to be smaller than what you're used to buying, and I found that out. I was cutting a size 14 pattern, and I was getting that gaping problem. I even had an issue in here, and I would always have to take it in. So I went down to a size 10, and that's my right size pattern. And I do have to make adjustments in other areas, but I get the fit in here that's close to impossible to adjust once you sew your garment together. So find your pattern size, and that's the size you're going to cut when you cut out your pattern pieces. Now keep in mind that this shirt, it goes down into the hip area, so you will likely have to make some adjustments to your pattern by blending from your whatever size you're cutting down to a larger size in that area, because you're gonna most likely be wider in this area. So I taught you guys how to do that in project number 2, I believe, when we did the maxi skirt. So you can refer back to that, or I'll show you again when we get ready to cut our pattern pieces out or adjust this pattern piece. So find your measurement, determine which line you're going to cut on, and then we're going to go ahead and start cutting our pattern pieces. Now the first thing you're going to notice when you get your pattern pieces, and we only need 4 pieces, pieces number 1, 2, 3, and 5. So the first thing you're going to notice is pieces 1 and 2 are long. That's because this pattern envelope includes a dress and a top. So to make the shirt, you're just going to cut on the line for view B or C, and we're making view C with the sleeves. So you're just going to cut right on that line for view C, and that's going to give you your shirt. And then we're going to go ahead and make the pattern adjustments. So what I want you to do is find your right size that you're going to cut. Go ahead and prepare your pattern pieces by ironing them flat before we go ahead and make the adjustments. Make sure you cut off this extension for the dress because we're only making the shirt. And then meet me back here. Okay, we are looking at pattern piece number 1. And I have cut off the extension for the skirt for the dress. And before we make the full bust adjustment, we're going to go ahead and make the adjustment for the hip area. Now, there is a scale on the bottom of your pattern that tells you what the finished measurement of the hip area is going to be after this garment is sewn together. So make sure you refer to that chart to know which line you should be cutting on. Now you took your hip measurement in project number 2 for your maxi skirt, so you're going to use that hip measurement to compare it to the finished hip measurement on this chart. So go ahead and find your finished measurement, and then we're going to use that cutting line for your hip measurement on your shirt. So my cutting line, my right size measurement tells me to cut a size 10 to have my neckline and shoulders fitted. So I'm going to cut a 10, but I need to blend down to a 14 for the hip area. However, I like for my shirts to be really snug, so I'm not going to go to a 14, I'm going to go to a 12. So using the technique that you learned in project number 2, using the hip curve ruler, you're going to go ahead and blend from your cutting line for your right size measurement at the bust area down to your finished measurement at the hip area. So let's say I'm going to go from a 10 to a 12. Or let's just say I'm going to go from a 10 to a 14. I'm going to take my hip curve ruler, grab a pencil, and starting at the bottom in the hip area, I'm going to line up my ruler. Oh, and just so you'll know, we're blending from the waist area down. We're not starting up here. We're just going to go from this area down. So take your ruler, and we're going to line it up right here. Actually, we're going to go this way first. We're going to blend from this area down to your cutting line. So line it up just to where it meets, and then go ahead and draw your line right to the cutting line that you're going to use. All right? And then turn your ruler over And we want to make sure we have a natural curve, not just a point and then it goes down. We want to make sure we have a natural curve. So we're going to turn this over, and following that line that we started on, we're going to blend it into this cutting line for a more natural curve. So this is our new cutting line right along here. And you can do this in ink pen or a marker to make sure you see your lines better. I did it in pencil because I won't be actually using this for my cutting line. Okay, so that's your cutting line. Next, we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut this pattern piece out, following your right size pattern at the top and then blending it into your cutting line for your hip area. So remember, whatever you do to the front, you need to do to the back. So go ahead and make the same adjustment on your back piece, and you can just place this front piece on top of your back piece. Lining up your notches and this line and the bottom edge, and then go ahead and just trace so that you don't have to do the curve ruler again. All right, so after you do that, then we're going to do the bust adjustment. Before we move on to that, I want to show you guys on pattern pieces 3 and 5, there was a question about how you know how many pieces to cut for each pattern piece. You'll see on piece number 1, the front, it tells you to cut 1 on the fold. The same thing for piece number back, or for the back piece. On piece number 3, it tells you to cut 1. So you're only going to cut 1 of these for the neckband. And then for piece number 5, it tells you to cut 2, but it doesn't say on the fold. So if the pattern tells you to cut a number of pieces and it doesn't say on the fold, that means you're going to have 2 separate pieces of this one away from the fold. And then I'm going to show you the layout when we get to that part, but I wanted to clarify that so that you will know that if it doesn't say on the fold, it means you're cutting 2 separate pieces. So go ahead, cut out your pattern pieces 1 and 3, 1, 2, 3, and 5 according to your size, and then we'll move forward. Okay, the next measurement that we're going to take is our full bust measurement, and we're going to use this measurement to make the alteration to the pattern piece, since we have gone down a size or 2 in the pattern that the pattern size that we're going to cut according to our right size measurement. So if you have a friend or a family member who can help you to take this measurement, that will be great. If not, you can take it on your own. What you're going to do is you're going to measure across the fullest part of your bust from the back, making sure that your tape measure is parallel to the floor. Take your tape measure, starting with the number 1, and wrap it around from the back, making sure that you're not twisting the tape measure. You want to make sure it's flat on your back, and bring it around across the fullest part of your bust. And make sure you insert 2 fingers under the tape measure so that you're not taking this measurement too snug. And again, make sure that the tape measure is parallel to the floor. So position yourself in front of a mirror and check your measurement, making sure it's parallel to the floor, and make sure that you're measuring across the fullest part of your bust. So look at that number, and you're going to jot that number down because we're going to use that when we do our full bust adjustment onto the pattern piece. So let's move along to the next step. Okay, we're looking at pattern piece number 1, the front of the shirt, and we have already cut it out with the adjustment for the hip. And what you're going to need to make this adjustment is some tracing paper, and you can pick up your tracing paper from your local fabric store or your local office department store or office supply store, or you can order it online. Okay, you're going to need your paper, scissors, straight pins, or pattern weights. Actually, you can use both. You're definitely going to need a straight pin for when we do the pivot and slide method. you can use the pattern weights to hold it down in the beginning. You're going to need your seam gauge. You're going to need 2 colored pens or markers, and you're going to need some clear tape. So to start, you will lay out your pattern piece on top of your tracing paper the way you see it here. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take your dark pen, or whichever, use your dark pen, and you're going to trace around the edges of this pattern piece all the way around. Go ahead and trace it, and I've done that ahead of time just to save time. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make a mark at the intersection where the shoulder and the armhole meet, and another mark at the intersection where the armhole and the side of the shirt meet. I've made the mark for the shoulder and armhole already, so I'm going to show you how to make that mark at your armhole and side. So take your seam gauge and place your slider at the 5/8 inch mark, and then you're going to place the seam gauge on the side, right on the side seam here, near the armhole, and then you're just going to make a mark right there at the edge of the seam gauge. Then you're going to take it and place it at the armhole with the slider right at the armhole, somewhere near that mark, and then you're going to make a mark at the edge of the seam gauge again. Then you remove it, and then this is where your seam line is, where those 2 lines intersect. Okay? Now, what we're going to do next is take a pen. Now, oh, I forgot to mention, you will notice I have a cutting mat under my tracing paper. If you have a cutting mat, you can use it, but the best thing to use under your tracing paper is cardboard. So you can either purchase the cardboard mats that they have at the fabric store or online, or you can just cut up a piece of cardboard that you have at home that's larger than your pattern piece. So what you're going to do is take a pen, remove your pattern weights if you have them there, and we're going to do something called the slide and pivot, or pivot and slide method. Before we do that, we need to mark out the distance that we need to add for the full bust adjustment, and that's what we're doing. We're making the bust line larger to fit, since we went down in a pattern size to fit the neck and shoulder area. So what you're going to do is compare your bust measurement that you took in the beginning to the finished bust measurement for the size of the pattern that you cut. So if you cut a size 10, the finished measurement for the bust on this garment is going to be 32. If your measurement is, let's say, a 36, then you go down, and there's no 36 here, but there's a 35.5. And because this is a knit fabric, you have stretch. So you would go ahead and use the measurement for a 14 for your finished garment. So if you measure 36, let's say 35.5, let's go with 36. You measure 36 and you cut a 32, that's a 4-inch difference. Now, if you have a difference larger than 4 inches, then you will need to do an extension. But we are within that 4 inches. So what we're going to do is add 1 inch, because we have to take the difference between our measurement and the finished pattern measurement and divide it by 4. So since we have a 4-inch difference, we're going to take that number and divide it by 4, and you get 1 inch. So we're going to add 1 inch to this side seam allowance, because we're going to have 4 sides, these 2 sides and the 2 sides for the back of the pattern, the back piece. So we're going to measure out using our seam guide. So move your slider to 1 inch. And then you're going to place the slider right here on the edge where the armhole and the side seam meet. And you're going to make a mark there. Okay. Now that's the mark we're going to use when we do the slide and pivot and slide method. So what we're going to do now is take your straight pin. I'm sorry, before you do that, yes, take your straight pin and place it right at the seam line where the shoulder and the arm meet. And then you're going to take your pattern and you're holding it down. Now if you have a cardboard, you'll be able to stick the pin in there and it'll stay in place without you having to hold it. But if you don't, you'll have to hold the pin in place, and then you will slide your pattern over to that mark just until the side edge meets that line that we drew. A little bit more. Okay, and then you will stop. You can remove your pin and place a pattern weight there, and place a pattern weight there. If you're using a cardboard, you can just pin it. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to draw our new armhole, and you will use your different color. I'm using a red pen, so you use a different color than what you drew your original line with, and just go ahead and mark along the armhole to get your new cutting line. And you're going to mark just until you hit the original line. So don't go inside of the line, just stop right when you hit the original line. After you have marked your new armhole, you're going to mark your notch and this little circle here that we will need for inserting the sleeve. So go ahead and fold back the pattern and just place a mark there and a mark there, and then go ahead and make that your dart. Not going in too deep because you don't want to go into your seam line. And then for your circle, find which number coincides with the size of the pattern that you cut, and go ahead and make your dot there. So just place your pin under where that dot is and just make a little dot. Okay, make sure that's lined back up the way it should be with your pattern on the edge where you drew your new armhole. Now what we're going to do is take your pin again, remove your weights or the other pins, and place your pin right at the seam line where the armhole and the side edge meet. Now you're going to pivot your pattern back the other direction until the waistline meets. So pivot it until the waistline, which is right here where this line is, where you see the curve start, you're going to stop right there. Go ahead and pin or place your pattern weights. And now we're going to draw this new side line. Now, this doesn't line up, and it's not supposed to. It's okay. We're just changing this side right here in the bust area, blending it down into our waistline. So go ahead and use your colored pen or marker and draw that new line. This may seem like a lot of work, but it will be worth it in the end to get a pattern that actually fits. That's a lot of the reason why people give up on sewing with patterns, because they can't get their garments to fit when they sew using a pattern. So if you go ahead and do the work ahead of time, then you can get a pattern that fits, or a garment that fits. Okay, so we have our new line. Now what we're going to do is remove our pattern, and then you'll see this is our new cutting line for the side and the armhole. And this should accommodate your bust measurement that you took. And you can go ahead and blend those lines if you like, or just cut along the dashes. The final step, you're going to replace or place your pattern piece back to its original position along the original tracing line. Pin it down or place your pattern weights. And then what you're going to do is in this area, you're going to pin the pattern piece to the tracing paper. So take your tape and pin. In those areas. And we need to do this before cutting out your pattern. Yes, one more. Now in the instructions, she teaches that you are to tape all the way around and then cut out your pattern. I don't do that because it's not necessary. This is the only part that's adjusted, so I just tape in that area, and that's the area that I'm going to cut around, and then I'm going to cut away all the extra tracing paper. So I will just demonstrate that for you. So I'm going to just go along the new cutting line, which is the red mark. Just a little bit past the red mark. And then what I will do, which is different from what Nancy teaches in the book, is I will go ahead and cut away the extra beneath the pattern piece because I don't need it. So I will just go under the pattern piece and cut that away. Flip it up and just cut that away. And so what you have left on the back is just that extension piece instead of all of this tracing paper that you don't need. Okay? Now, remember, you're going to do the same thing to the back piece that you did to the front piece. Using the same technique, make the extension. And because we went down in a pattern size to accommodate the neck and shoulder area, and we cut on a size 10, we also cut on a size 10 for our sleeve. And because we have made this adjustment and made this armhole bigger or longer, we need to do the same thing on our sleeve, or else the sleeve will be too small for this area and then you won't have a good fit. So we're going to make an adjustment on the sleeve as we did on our front piece. So go ahead and grab your sleeve, and I'm going to teach you how to make that adjustment. Remember, you have to do the same thing to your back piece. So you'll get a new piece of tracing paper and follow the same steps. If you have the book that I suggested, Pattern Fitting with Confidence, it's on page 20 where she teaches how to make this adjustment. So let's go ahead now, and we need to make an adjustment on the sleeve because we went down in a pattern size to accommodate the neck and shoulder area. If we changed, or if we left this as is and used the sleeve that we cut out on a 10, it's not going to fit. The sleeve is going to be too small to fit into this area. So we need to make the same, or add the same inches on the sleeve, the underarm sleeve section that we did on the side, so that this sleeve will fit in properly with your armhole. So I'm going to teach you how to make that adjustment on your sleeve next. Okay, let's go ahead and adjust our sleeve pattern piece, piece number 5. So I have gone ahead and outlined the edges of the sleeve with my black pen. I have also measured out 1 inch, or before that, make sure you mark your seam lines on the sides of your pattern, just as we did with the front piece. So from the edge of the side seam, I measured 5/8 of an inch and made a mark. Then I measured from the top 5/8, made a mark, and that is our seam line for this direction and that direction. I did the same thing on this side. And what you're going to do at the top, because this is where we're going to be pivoting from, is you're going to make that same 5/8 inch mark, but just a horizontal mark from the center of the top cap. So place your seam gauge there at the center and just make a mark there to indicate that that is your stitching line, your 5/8 inch stitching line. Then we are going to put the slider at the 1 inch mark, because we measured out 1 inch or added 1 inch to the front piece. We need to add 1 inch to the sleeve. So measure out from the side seam 1 inch and mark. Same thing here, measure out 1 inch and mark. And now we're ready to start making our new cutting lines. Okay, make sure that's lined up. Then you're going to take your pin and you're going to place it right at the stitch line, the 5/8 inch line at the top of your sleeve, the sleeve cap. And you're going to pivot your pattern to the right until it hits this line. So pivot all the way until it hits that line. Wherever it hits, that's where you're going to stop. Okay, let's go ahead and place your pattern weight, or if you have pins, just pin it in place. And then what you're going to do is you're going to mark your new sleeve cap halfway. So you're going to, where it stops here is where you're going to stop, or you're going to use your colored pin. So go ahead and mark. The new cutting line all the way out to the side. And then you're going to go down, not to the end, but about maybe an inch. After drawing this 1 inch side line, I want you to go back and draw in your notch and your little circle for the sleeve insertion. So again, mark there, and then meet the lines, not going too far into the seam. You want to try to end about right there, which is good. Go ahead and make your circle at the dot for your cutting line. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our pin again, place it at the seam line here, and we're going to pivot the pattern piece back until it hits this line. I've done it ahead of time and made my mark, but I want to show you guys how to do it. So you're going to pivot until any part of your pattern meets that line, and it's the very edge where mine meets. Yours may meet in a different place depending on the size that you're cutting. So that's where mine meets. Then we're going to draw that new line. So it's drawn. And when you lift it back, it looks a little strange. It looks like it doesn't match up. It's okay, because we're going to cut it and just curve it when we're cutting. And our new cutting line on the sleeve cap stops here. Well, the side stops here. We need to make those meet. So what we're going to do is draw this out and then make them meet. Just like that. Just make them meet. And that'll be okay. Now, what we're going to do is take the pattern piece, put it back in its original position with the original tracing lines. And you're going to do the same thing to this side that you did to the side we've completed. And when you've done that, you're going to go ahead and tape the pieces or the pattern piece down to your tracing paper, and you're going to cut on the new cutting line just as we did with our front pattern piece. And then when you've done that, we're going to go ahead and move on and revisit the pattern instruction sheet. But before doing that, I want to bring to your attention at the bottom of this pattern piece, the sleeve, it tells you that there's a 5/8 inch hem allowance, or hem allowed. That means when you get ready to hem the sleeve, you're going to press up 5/8 of an inch. Now, it doesn't tell you that on the pattern instruction sheet. It just tells you to fold up the seam allowance. So just to note, it's a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and we will go ahead and mark that information, or you can go ahead and mark that information on your pattern instruction sheet, but we'll do that when we go back to it. And then again, for the skirt front and back, the hem allowance is 1 1/4 inch. And for your neck band, the hem allowance, or the seam allowance actually, is 3/8 inch. Now in the pattern guide sheet, it does tell you to attach the sleeve band or the neck band with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So that information is there for you. However, for the bottom hem of your shirt and your sleeve, that information is not given. So I just wanted to point that out to you. So let's go ahead and take a look at the pattern instruction sheet again. Okay, here is another look at the pattern instruction guide. I wanted to take another look at this as a review for you guys, just to make sure you're understanding and following along as we're sewing. You'll notice that I'm not referring back to the pattern instruction guide as we're sewing as I did in project number 1, but I just wanted to go over it with you guys right now. So looking at the top left section, you will see illustrations of all of the pattern of the garments that are included in this pattern. These up top are the front view, and the ones on bottom are the back view. Next, in this section, you get an illustration of what all of the pattern pieces look like when they're cut out. So up here, you get to see what they look like, and down below is a description of what these pattern pieces are with their corresponding numbers. Over in this section, you get the information for choosing or laying out your pattern, sewing directions, and how to choose your pattern. And this pattern is a multi-size pattern, meaning that there are multiple sizes, multiple cutting lines on the tissue sheets for each pattern piece. So you get information there, and then this information talks to you or teaches you about cutting and the layout for cutting. And then over to the right, you get your sewing directions with the bold words that you'll find in the instructions as you're sewing along. So this is your glossary to refer back to find out how to carry out that technique when you see it. And down below, you get all of your cutting layouts, and this tells you how to lay out your fabric and how to lay out your pattern pieces on top of the fabric. So you will see that I have highlighted that sections, and we're going to be sewing view C. So I've highlighted this area for the pieces that we'll use, the fabric width that we're using, and you'll notice there's only one option, and that's the 60-inch width, and they do that for a reason, so you want to stick with that. And this layout is for width nap fabrics. So if you're using a one-way direction fabric, a corduroy, stripes, or plaids, then this layout would be okay. But as a beginner, I advise you to stay away from those types of fabrics. And then I've highlighted the pieces that we're using. On to page 2. We're doing view C, the tunic. They call it a tunic. I'm just referring to it as a shirt. We're doing view C. And so we will be following instruction number 1. And then you'll notice here in bold, it says for neckband, see dress A, steps 2 through 5. They don't repeat the instructions for the tunic because it's the same as the instructions for the dress. So you would refer over to the dress and follow steps 2 through 5 as they direct. Then you would come back over to the tunic and move on to step number 2. And then here in bold it says for view B. You can ignore that because we're not sewing view B. On to page 3. You will see steps 3, 4, and 5 that are highlighted. And so these are the steps that we will be following. And again, I will not be referring back to the pattern guide sheet as I'm sewing, but you can. As I'm demonstrating the construction of this garment, you can make sure you're reading the instructions to see exactly what I'm doing. Okay, so let's go ahead and cut out the pattern, make sure you cut out your pieces using the new cutting guidelines that you have if you've made adjustments, and we will be ready to sew. Okay, now I want to show you how to find the crosswise grain on your fabric. There was a question about that. Now, you learned in the beginning when we started the course that the ends of your fabric have selvages, and these are the manufactured ends that the companies create when they're making the fabric. So you will always have this lengthwise grain parallel to your selvages. Now the crosswise grain is perpendicular to your selvages, and those are usually not lined up properly when you get your fabric because it's not cut at the fabric store or in the warehouse when you order your fabric online. So in order to find that, there are two different methods that I'm going to show you. The first method is going to be the snip and rip, and you will do that on fabrics that you're able to rip with your hands. The other method, we're going to use our ruler, our cutting mat, and our rotary cutter to trace and cut. So starting with your rip or snip and rip, you're going to take your fabric, and this is 100% cotton fabric, which is easy to tear. So any fabrics that are easy to tear, you will be able to use this method. So you will line up your selvages even with each other, and then you're going to take your scissors, and let me turn it over to this side, closest to me, and our selvages are still even. And you're going to just snip on this side, making sure we're going in far enough, and snip on that side. And then what you're going to do is open it out. Now you're going to be working with a lot more fabric than this, so just keep that in mind. So you will open it out, and where you snipped it, just rip it. And as you're ripping, it's tearing along the crosswise grain evenly. So do the same thing on the other side. Just rip it. Okay? And then you're going to take it and fold it back with the selvages meeting and line that up. So line up your selvages, straighten out that. Oh, before you do that, what you can do, or what you should do, and you're going to need the help of a partner to do this, is you're going to stretch your fabric. And remember, you're going to be working with a whole lot more yardage than this, so you will really need the help of a partner. You're going to grab your fabric at opposite corners. So you stand on one corner and have your partner or your helper stand at the opposite corner, and you're going to stretch the fabric. Okay? And then you're going to do the same thing with the other corners. Just stretch your fabric, and that's getting everything back in line. Then you'll go ahead and lay it back out and line it up. So line up your selvages evenly, and then straighten out your fabric. And you will have an even lengthwise grain and even crosswise grains. And let's flip it over to make sure. And yes, we're even on the sides and we're even on the end here. So that's how you find your crosswise grain on tearable fabric, rippable fabric. Now, for a fabric that you can't tear, here's what you're going to do. First, I need to introduce you to the new tools that you will use for this method. This is a cutting mat, and this is what you guys saw me use earlier when we made pattern adjustments. And this is the lip edge ruler, and it's an accompaniment. It accompanies the cutting mat, and you will find these at your local fabric store, or you can order them online. They're in the same department, so you'll find them right next to each other. And then there is the rotary cutter that you're going to use to make the cut. So with your fabric on top of your cutting mat, you're going to line up this edge, the short edge, with your selvage evenly, making sure you are catching in the ends or leaving enough fabric to cut off the ends. So line that up evenly. There is also a square ruler, which is a lot bigger than this one, that you can use to do this, and you'll find that in the same area that you find your cutting mat. So line it up, and what you're going to do is take a marker or a pen and just mark that line. The important part is making sure that your ruler is perfectly even with the selvage end of your fabric. Okay, then you're going to take your ruler and line it up along the mark that you already made. Move it down until you go off your fabric, making sure that you're lining it up straight with that line, and continue the line all the way to the fold, or whichever edge of the, well, yeah, it would be the fold. Okay, then you're going to set that aside. And what you can do next, you can do this two ways. You can take your scissors and cut, but you would have to be very careful, making sure that you're not lifting the bottom of your fabric up too much. So you would make sure you want to keep your blade on the cutting table, which is what I taught you guys to do in the beginning anyway. But the best way is to use your ruler that you used for the mark. So starting down here, and the lip edge of this ruler usually goes on the edge of your cutting mat to keep it from moving while you're cutting. So you're going to put it there and line it up with that line that we just created, and we're going to cut. So make sure you apply pressure to your ruler and just go along your fabric like that as far as you can go with the ruler. Then you're going to take your ruler, flip it over and move it down. And I'm flipping it over because we don't want the lip edge to interfere with a flat line of cutting. So we're going to line your ruler up with the edge of the fabric on this end and with the marking line that we drew on the other end. And we're going to continue the cut all the way off the selvage, applying pressure to your ruler. Okay, and that helps to give you that nice even crosswise grain or edge for your fabric. You will do the same thing on the opposite side, and then that's there you have it. So let's go ahead and lay out our pattern pieces and begin the cutting process. Okay, you're looking at the wrong sides of my fabric. I have my fabric folded over onto itself with the right sides facing. Now, let me answer a question you guys had about the right side and the wrong side of the fabric. With some fabrics, there is an obvious wrong side. But with others, like this one, you can't really tell which side is the right side or the wrong side. In that case, you get to choose which side you want to be the right side. So I have chosen my right side. So I have a folded edge on this side, and I have a folded edge on that side, because that's according to the pattern guideline, the layout. So we're going to take our pattern pieces and follow the layout on the pattern instruction guide, and you're going to place piece number 1 on the fold. You're going to place piece number 2 on the fold on the opposite side. Then you will pin or use your pattern weights, and then you will cut. Now for the sleeve and the neckband, there's a different layout. So after you have cut these two pieces out, you're going to have some leftover fabric. Oh, and just to let you know, this, I'm using this fabric. This is leftover from one of the maxi skirts that I made. I figured since I have so much left over, I'll use it to make our shirt. So go ahead and leave this side folded, and we're going to open out the other end. So you will take your sleeve and place it right here. It's already folded, making sure that you line up the grain line arrow on your pattern piece with the selvages of your fabric so that it's on the grain. You will cut that piece, and then for the neckband, you're going to place it on a single layer, single thickness of fabric, and you're going to cut one piece. All right, so that's the layout. You can go ahead and lay out your pattern pieces, cut everything out, and meet me at the sewing machine. Okay, we're ready to sew. Now, before we start stitching, I want to draw your attention to the pattern instruction sheet on page 3. Remember, I told you guys that we would make a couple of notations where the seam allowances are. So on step number 3, at the bottom where it says press up hem, go ahead and write in 5/8 of an inch, because that's the hem that we're going to press up that they don't mention here. And then in step number 5 at the top where it says press up hem, this is for the hem of the skirt, you're going to write in 1 1/4 of an inch so that you will know how much you need to press up. Okay, now as far as what you should have so far to start sewing, you should have all of your fabric pieces cut out, your straight pins, ballpoint, because we're sewing with knit fabric, your little nippers or your small scissors, your seam ripper in case you make mistakes, and go ahead and wind an extra bobbin. You should have one in your machine already, and your machine should be threaded, but go ahead and wind an extra bobbin just in case you run out of the one that you have. We will be starting with a straight stitch on a 2.3 length straight stitch, and your width should be somewhere between 2 and 3, wherever it needs to be, to make sure that your needle is at the center of this presser foot. So go ahead and get your settings in place, and we will start by practicing finishing the seam allowances, because I told you guys I would show you 3 different methods. So I'm going to start with that. So get yourself set up and meet me back here.